I'm Mercy Davison. I'm the planner here at the Town of Normal. I'd like to welcome you to the third in our lecture series. I know many of you, how many of you were here for the first lecture that Dr. Holsinger did? Excellent. It's like a fan club. How many of you were able to make it out to One Normal Plaza for Ruthie Cobb's? Nice. That is great. Okay. And today's going to be another great lecture. A quick note, next Sunday we will have Dr. Mark Wyman giving his lecture pertaining to race in Normal. Dr. Wyman, where are you at? There he is right there, if you want to talk to him afterwards. And then there will be two lectures after, or two panel discussions after that. So basically book your calendar for 2 o'clock every Sunday through October 11th. And everything from here on out will be in this room. I'd like to just do some quick housekeeping, although since most of you were here for Dr. Holsinger's lecture, I'll just quickly point out bathrooms are that way, emergency exits are both ways. Hopefully there will be no emergency. If you haven't been in this building before, please feel free to look at the artwork, and you should come back during the week, during business hours, to look at the rest of the art. And we also have very nice merchandise on sale outside of this room, and it's on sale all week during business hours at the town clerk's office on the second floor. Some of these items are running out. Christmas is right around the corner. Please buy something. And now for today's lecture. Mike Matejka is the Governmental Affairs Director for the Great Plains Laborers District Council, which represents 13,000 union laborers in 15 local unions in central Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, and South Dakota. For the past 35 years, he has edited the Grand Prairie Union News. He is the Vice President of the Illinois Labor History Society and past president of the McLean County Museum of History. He writes and speaks frequently on labor, transportation, and other issues. The second speaker will be Dr. Terri Ryburn, who is a historian, a writer, an actor, also a published playwright, and a stand-up comedian. She retired after working 25 years at Illinois State University. For the first 21 years, Terri was working full-time and took classes part-time, which culminated in a bachelor's, master's, and ultimately a doctorate in history. Her dissertation topic was Route 66, which she'll be speaking about today. Terri's interest in Route 66 began when she was 5 years old, when her family traveled Route 66 to California. And incidentally, she has just finished a screenplay based on that trip. More later on that. Most importantly, she is restoring Ryburn Place, the former Sprague's Super Service at 305 Pine Street in Normal. The building is on the National Register of Historic Places. It's a Town of Normal local landmark, and it's in the Route 66 Association of Illinois Hall of Fame. And today she'll be talking about the 1926 through 1940 original alignment of Route 66 through Normal and its impact on our town. But first, I will hand the microphone off to Mike Matejka.
Thank you, Mercy. And one very important fact about Terri and I that did not get mentioned is we're both ISU graduates. And we've got our esteemed row of the ISU history faculty over here, our mentors. So we thank them for putting us in a position to talk about these things today. What we're going to do is I'll kind of give a broader overview of transportation, its impact on the community, railroads, roads, airlines in Normal, Illinois, if you can believe that, and then turn it over to Terri for a little bit more of the specific little trip down Route 66 in our community here. So, I think it's important when we think about transportation, it really changes who we are. And of course, Normal wouldn't exist if it was not at a transportation crossroads. It brings new people in, it brings commercial opportunity, it kind of mixes things up and connects people to maybe a faster, broader world and a broader way of life. Okay, little clicker. There we go. Here's an early map of Illinois when you're into statehood. Notice McLean County is not marked here. We're part of that huge upper 2/3 of the state because Europeans did not live here, because if you were going to be commercially involved in anything, you had to be near water because that was your means of transportation. So look at how many counties we've got platted In the southern part of the state where you've got access to the Ohio and the Mississippi, you've got a way to get to market. But this northern part of the state is pretty uninhabited by Europeans because you really don't have access to transportation. Either you're on the water or you're off on a long hike if you're going to go anywhere. And if you're off on a long hike, there's really not going to be any clear paths through the woods or anything. I like to point out to people that once Europeans began to settle here, we all know where Towanda Barnes 150 is out there on the southeast part of Bloomington. That was originally a stagecoach stop for the Champaign coming eastward from Indianapolis to Bloomington kind of area. A good day on foot would have been 6 miles just because there was no clear way to go. So, having transportation is very critical for development. And I think one of the unique things about us is that, stop and think about it, Bloomington-Normal, there is no reason to have a city here, geographically. Peoria is on a river. Peoria has a reason to exist. We are no different than Gibson City or Hudson, but we happen to be a city because we built up around a transportation infrastructure. And that was very critical to the development of this community. And when we look back at Normal itself, the idea of what was known originally as the North Junction, the place where the Illinois Central Railroad, what's Constitution Trail today, came building from the north to the south, and the Chicago Railroad building from St. Louis to Chicago, having two railroads intersect in the 1850s puts you in a very novel situation. So it gives Normal something that very few other communities have at the time, which is basically statewide access, and says a lot about our ability to attract the first state college, the first state teachers college, because we are at an infrastructure to point where people have access to go places. The Illinois Central Railroad, Constitution Trail, built beginning in 1851, 1852, from Galena, Freeport, and building south to Cairo, Illinois, with a branch from Centralia to Chicago. At the time of its construction, it is the world's largest construction project. There are over 4,000 people that show up on the payroll of the Illinois Central Railroad, mostly immigrant workers who come to build this basically railroad across the prairie. This is a painting from the Illinois Sesquicentennial in 1968, but I think it tells a great story about the building of the railroad. Notice the landscape in the back. No farms, no grain elevators, no fences. This is open prairie. If I can get Terry's little pointer to work on here.
First button, Mike.
First button. Oh, there we go. You're building a railroad across the prairie. You've got the workers' settlement. That Irish term shanty comes to us during this time of railroad construction, and basically hand labor. So even if you take the Constitution Trail through here, notice as you go south into Bloomington, you go through cuts and you go through fills where you're going up and down. That's people with shovels and picks and maybe a few horses. So very intensive hand labor construction. The other thing about the Illinois Central Railroad that's unique is it's one of the first federal land grant operations. So in order to build this railroad in what's basically a very lightly settled area, our senator at the time, Stephen A. Douglas, convinces the federal government to give the railroad company a square mile of land for every mile of track that they build. So that puts the Illinois Central Railroad in the position of being the largest landowner in the state of Illinois. And so to do this now, they have to attract people to come settle in Illinois. And they put out these wonderful little brochures and publications. And Mark Wyman, with his book, Immigrants in the Valley, is another great person to ask about this. But you can see the little clip there from education. Your child will grow up within sight of a college and a school and a church. Probably not true. If you read the agricultural part of this, it will tell you Illinois has incredibly mild winters. You can grow cotton anywhere in the state of Illinois, okay? Their idea was not to be honest. Their idea was to attract settlers. and to bring people in. And of course, many of our little towns, north and south through here, are established by the Illinois Central Railroad, who built a station every 10 miles along the way. So Hayworth, Illinois is named after one of the British investors who put money into the Illinois Central Railroad. But this is a very, very big project, and again, creates a real boom for the state of Illinois, and particularly here in McLean County. In that first decade of railroad construction, our population almost triples. Because there's not only a railroad, but two railroads here, it gives people a great incentive to come here, whether they're going to farm, whether they're going to be commercial, whether they're going to be a landowner, whatever their occupation is going to be. One other great story out of this time period is our area's first millionaire, Ashiel Gridley, made a lot of his money off this land sales. And originally, the Illinois Central Railroad was platted to run 10 miles east of here. And Gridley was our state senator at the time and convinced with a group of other legislators to move the railroad 10 miles over so it would run through what is now Bloomington, where Gridley happened to live at the time. As soon as that was accomplished and railroad construction started, Gridley resigned his seat in the state senate and became the land agent for the Illinois Central Railroad. And that's where he made his fortune. So he used politics to kind of maneuver himself into this population. But just from these numbers, you can see McLean County alone triples in population. At the same time, look at the growth of railroads just even in one decade. In a 3-4 year period, going from less than 100 miles of railroad to almost 3,000 miles of railroad. This is an incredible building boom for the state of Illinois and puts our community in a very great position. So locating a junction, two railroads crossing each other, the town of Normal becomes an attractive place for Jesse Fell to convince the state legislature to locate the Normal school here, because then you can get students from northern Illinois, from southern Illinois, from Chicago area, from St. Louis area. They're all within a day's train journey from their home to come to school and learn to be a school teacher. Now, they're not going to go home every weekend like students do now, but they'll go home maybe 2 or 3 times a year, but at least they'll have access. And this is the picture of the first depot in Normal, which was a wonderful little gingerbread structure. But again, kind of a small town depot, but gives you a little feel for what went on here. So this became a great place to locate a school, and you can see, of course, the old main building and a little sparse settlement that's growing up around it. But having the railroad confluence here makes a big difference. Just for fun, and this is not Normal specific, but I think this is a fun little poster. This is announcing the first through train service from Chicago to St. Louis. And if you could get close enough to read the fine print here, you would see the time travel from Chicago to St. Louis is 15 1/4 hours. All right? So what you would do if you're going from Chicago, you would get on the Chicago and Rock Island Railroad, ride the Rock Island to LaSalle, Illinois. LaSalle, you get off the Rock Island Railroad, ride the Illinois Central Railroad down to Bloomington. You get off the Illinois Central, take a carriage across town to the west side of town to get on the Chicago and Alton Railroad, and then you ride that down to Alton, Illinois, and then you get on a Mississippi River packet boat and float into St. Louis. And you can do this in the amazing time of 15 1/4 hours. Now, if you read medical journals of the 1850s and 1860s, they will tell you human beings are not made to go 30 miles an hour. And if you expose yourself to prolonged train travel, you may start beginning to develop some very strange conditions, because our bodies and physiology are not meant to be confined in coaches with lots of other people in a smoky environment and speeding along at that kind of rate of speed. So, but again, it gives you a little sense of how rough the conditions were, but at the same time, if you can get from Chicago to St. Louis in half a day, pretty amazing when you think about what previously had been a multi-day journey before this kind of development took place. And I think it's fun. This is an air view of what we would call uptown today in the 1940s. Here's the Junction. You can see the railroad station down here. And at this time period, you would have had a lot of smaller businesses that got their express shipments in on the railroad. Merchants would have got their stuff in. Remember, until a few years ago, about 3 blocks north here was a lumber yard. So a lot of that stuff would have come in by rail because that's where people got their coal, got their lumber, got their stuff from Sears and Roebuck. So your business district kind of clustering around the junction of the 2 railroad lines was pretty critical in terms of, again, a little residential area developing, but especially a little business district to go with it, because not only could you ride the train to places, but you could also get shipments in from a variety of sources, and you could also ship stuff out to other places. Now we're going to stray across Division Street here, but part of economic development of Bloomington-Normal together is the Chicago and Alton Railroad shops on the west side of Bloomington. And the Chicago and Alton Railroad deciding to build their main repair shops here, halfway between Chicago and St. Louis, was another huge economic boom for this area. The shops were located here in 1854, and by the turn of the century, 19th, 20th century, into the 1940s, there's about 1,800 people working in the shops. Some live in Normal, many live in Bloomington, but a pretty high technology thing for the time period. You've got the roundhouse down here, where the locomotives are serviced on a daily basis. The locomotive back shop, where locomotives were repaired and built, had a 200-ton crane in there that could pick up an entire locomotive. The car shops are up here. This would be Normal up in the top here, but the car shops where cars are built and repaired. Really highly skilled group of machinists, boilermakers, carpenters, very skilled workers that kind of built an industrial foundation for our community. There were a total of 31 buildings in that complex. So it really, before State Farm became the biggest employer in town, that was the place where you went for a good job in Bloomington-Normal. Normal had a number of train stations. We saw the little gingerbread one. That one lasted until 1924, and then this brick station was built where this building is today. And again, what was unique with it was that it was not just a place to get packages and to get on the train, but it was a control point between the 2 railroads. So there was always somebody on duty watching to make sure if one train was coming from one line or one from another, to put the stop signals up to stop one train from running into another. So for many years it had 2 bay windows on both sides. You could see both sets of tracks to see where the trains were coming from. That station was torn down in 1924. The last passenger train probably stopped there about 1958-59, was a late night train from Chicago that stopped at every town to drop off mail. So for a number of years, Normal had no passenger train service. You had to go to Bloomington to catch the train. Throughout this time period, though, freight service continued, and this picture here is over at Good Yard, over by the Mitsubishi plant. So there's still a very active part of railroad freight service that comes through our period. And on June 10th, 1990 is when the building across the street opened, and a railroad passenger service came to our community again. And then, of course, in 2012 is when this building opened. And for those that don't keep track of statistics, this is the 4th busiest Amtrak stop in the Midwest. So Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Normal are Amtrak's 4 busiest stations in this part of the country in their Midwestern system. So again, a real testament to the potential of what transportation can do. And I like to see what will happen in the next 10 and 15 years if our higher speed 110 mile an hour trains start running from here to Chicago. We will actually be closer to Chicago in time than if you take Chicago's Metra commuter rail system and go out to the far ends of it. It will take longer from the far western suburbs to get into Chicago than it would go from Normal to Chicago. And if that happens, again, it could very much change the economics of our community, because we could have people who could live here and actually commute into the city, or we could have people like city life who could commute here. And you look when those kind of higher speed rail systems develop, oftentimes there's, again, a change in demographics in a community. The other thing, too, I wanted to touch on very briefly is part of transportation has also been public transit. And beginning in 1867, Bloomington and Normal were linked together by what was known as the Bloomington-Normal Horse Railway Company. And basically it was a mule or horse-pulled railroad car, little 4-truck car that ran from Bloomington to Normal and back again. At times they had little miniature steam engines that pulled it, but that frightened the horses too much, so they went back to horses and mules. In 1890, that became an electric trolley system, and we had electric trolleys running in the community until December of 1937. And that's when, for those of you who are great conspiracy buffs, a company called National City Lines bought up the trolley system. And National City Lines is very famous because it was a corporate holding company owned by General Motors, Firestone, and Standard Oil. And they bought up trolley systems all over the country and replaced the trolleys with GM buses on Firestone tires running on Standard Oil. So much of America's rail transit system was kind of taken apart in the 1930s and 40s because of National City Lines. And this became, in 1972, what we call Connect Transit today. Our Bloomington-Normal public transit system took over the system from the private company from National City Lines. One more, this is not a lot to show here, but Bloomington's first airport was in Normal. And it's fun to go up to Carrick Elevator, north of town here. And if you go on the west side of the elevator, you'll find this stone here that says Bloomington's first airport. And was basically an open field north of Normal there. And it lasted until 1934 when, under Franklin Roosevelt, a Works Progress Administration WPA project, the current airport infrastructure on the east side of Bloomington construction was begun on that. But our first airline service began north of here. And this company that was called Century Airlines, which eventually became known as American Airlines, flew from Chicago to St. Louis, stopping, landing at Springfield, landing at Bloomington, and going on to Chicago. It didn't last very long because it's kind of hard to land a passenger airline in the mud. And so they only landed here when the earth was clear and dry, which was not that often. So our airline service was very spotty and didn't last very long, but Normal can have the claim of having the first commercial airline service in the Twin City, thanks to this development here. Last thing I want to do, and then I'm going to turn it over to Terri here, is just talk about roads a little bit. And particularly in the early 20th century, a political movement known as a hard road movement. Paved roads became very important, particularly for rural communities who wanted access into more urban areas. Having a paved road was very, very critical. What's kind of fun, this is a 1921 Illinois highway map, and it's probably very hard to see, but here and there you'll see little pieces of red on the map. That's the state highway system. The pieces in red are those that are actually paved. Okay? So, and Terri will probably share this story. There's a little section just south of Shirley, was what, a mile and a half? So if you wanted to have a joyride, you went out down by Shirley because you had a mile and a half of actual pavement to run on. So beginning in the 1920s is when there was this state movement to begin to pave the roads. And again, part of it was rurally driven by putting rural people, farmers, a way to get to town, get to market much easier than having to pull their crops in wagons and horse-drawn wagons, and also a way to connect communities together. And again, when we think of how we sit with the intersection of multiple interstates here, you can look again at Bloomington-Normal and already see a cross-section of roads starting to come together in our community, and that eventually becomes the three interstates that are so important to us today in terms of continuing that kind of economic opportunity. And of course, building those roads meant jobs. It meant you had road contractors, you had laborers, you had operating engineers, you had a variety of people getting jobs, particularly during the Depression with the WPA and some of those projects gave a great opportunity for people to go to work on a government project to build roads. And this picture here is North Main Street in the 1930s when that was being paved. But again, very, very important to not only linking Bloomington and Normal together, but linking the smaller towns together and putting us on kind of a national crossroads here. And again, the highway, just like the railroad, changes us. Again, this is about a 1940 picture. We did a close-up of it earlier. And again, there's the Junction, there's the commercial district, and most of your residential area is within walking distance of what we would call uptown Normal today. You could get by without a car pretty easily. But the highway really began to change that. And we began to build more and more to the periphery of the community. This would be the Farm Bureau Country Financial Building out there on Towanda and construction in the early 1960s. And that's what was known at the time as the Beltway up there on the edge. There's not a fast food restaurant in sight, is there? But the construction of those kind of paved roads and that kind of interstate system, again, changed the fabric of the community, made us a car-dependent community, put us in a situation now where public transit became something that was not used by very many people because to get around town, you pretty much had to have a vehicle. So it kind of, again, changed the fabric of who we are. And again, there's a view, there's State Farm up there on the left, looking up Veterans Parkway in the 1970s. You can see kind of the big box, big roof kind of change in architecture. But look how many parking lots you can see in that picture. So suddenly our land usage patterns change because of road construction, because suddenly if you're going to have any kind of area, you have to have probably twice as much parking as you have building space. So how we use land, how we travel, how we interact as a community changes greatly with the construction of roads and kind of becoming a car culture America. Think about our neighborhoods. There's Mark Wyman's house over there on School Street, right? Front porch, no driveway. And you sat out on your front porch and talked to your neighbors and saw people and things like that, all right? That was a pedestrian way of living and a pedestrian way of being. But then look at the other picture and think about most subdivisions and housing today. The first thing you see on a house is a garage. If you go out to our newer developments on the east side and the far west side, I love it that the garage is prominent, but most of them have a little front porch. I'd like even get two chairs on it, but at least it's the idea of a front porch should still be there. And like the development at the bottom of the picture here, there's no sidewalk. You can go to work, stop at the grocery store, pull into your garage, shut the garage door, carry your groceries in, and not really have to interact with other people around you. It makes for a much more atomized way of life because you're now living in a culture where you're cocooned in a house and cocooned in a car, and oftentimes you don't develop that sense of community that interaction brings to us. So again, now I think we're at another point because you look at uptown development and it is centered around what? Pedestrians. We want people out of the car and walking and talking and moving around. So in a sense, are we going back to the kind of community that maybe was here 50 or 60 years ago? I mean, think of things like go to the bank, go to the grocery store, go get your pharmaceuticals. You don't necessarily have to leave your automobile to do those things. And then again, having interstates, having access to larger markets, having ways for people to come here, very much changes the community, makes us a very automotively centered community, and again, builds a whole new business structure around the periphery of the community that services that automobile and that kind of transportation network. And of course, we can think of all the businesses that grow up around the automobile. You know, we make cars at Mitsubishi, we insure cars at State Farm and Country. We eat from our car tray with a Steak and Shake beginning here, which Terri will talk about more. But a whole economic infrastructure begins to build up around the automobile. So the transportation, is just a very critical part of economic development. Who we become, where we're going, I think is very much tied up with those issues, and kind of forms who we are, how we interact, and how we live. And so what I'm going to do now is ask you to climb into your 34 Ford, put it in gear. You're coming down the road past Towanda, and you're coming into Normal. So I'm going to turn it over to Terri here, and she's going to show you where you can get your gas.
I'll edit this part out, of course. Okay, is that good? We are going to take that step back in time and travel along Route 66 today. Let me just get the clicker here. And I'm primarily talking about Route 66 through Normal from 1926 to 1940, before the Beltline came about. Quickly, I just want to tell you about my interest in Route 66. Some of you have heard me speak about it. I did travel the road when I was 5 years old, when my father moved us from Bloomington to California. We went in a pickup truck, and I had 4 brothers, my mom and dad, myself, and my dad's 2 hunting dogs in that pickup truck. So for the kids, it was a wonderful adventure. I've never forgotten it, and I think that's where I get my passion for traveling today. It was not so much fun for the adults. I always like to show a slide of Route 66 so people understand that it did start in Chicago and ended in Los Angeles. So it's kind of a colorful, fun little slide to look at. It did start in Chicago. There are people in California who will tell you it started in California and ended in Chicago, but that is just not true. We in Illinois know the truth. Okay, Mike has already talked about the muddy roads here and the need for improved roads. This is what a motorist encountered prior to the hard roads, a muddy pit of our rich McLean County soil. And how many of you still call it the hard road? Anybody? Ruthie Cobb, I love you. Anyone else? Well, at least you've heard older people, such as ourselves, talk about the hard road. And with good reason. Obviously, this is not a hard road. Okay. Route 4 was the forerunner of Route 66, and it's no surprise that it closely followed the Chicago and Alton Railroad tracks, because they followed a path that Native Americans made through the highest and driest ground. In 1922, the bed for Route 4 was prepared by horses dragging special equipment. Now, the laborers received 40 cents an hour for their back-breaking efforts, and in 1923, cement was poured through Normal Bloomington. It followed roughly the same route that the first alignment of Route 66 would take through town. It's interesting to note that although mechanized equipment was available for this work, and you did see some of that in Mike's slides, it was stored during the Depression in order to put more men back to work. By the 1920s, the United States was already experiencing hard times as economic conditions pointed to the coming Depression. People looked for sources of income that were not affected by the ups and downs of the economy. They built gas stations, tourist courts, cafes, grocery stores, bus and truck lines, and provided entertainment or sold souvenirs along Route 4. Their instincts were right. The service industry boomed and businesses along the road prospered. In 1926, construction began on Route 66, and you've already seen that marvelous slide that Mike had of the red segments that were already paved. Eventually, Route 66 was a 2,448-mile highway that stretched from the corner of Jackson Street and Michigan Avenue in Chicago to the Santa Monica Pier in California. The pavement was poured in 6 to 10-inch thick slabs across 2 lanes, each 9 feet wide. A Model A Ford was nearly 6 feet wide, so had about 1.5 feet on either side as it sped down this new highway at 35 to 40 miles an hour. Now, sometimes we have the idea that someone opened a big cement mixer in Chicago. Oops. Sorry, technologically challenged. Okay, here we go. And that the cement just kind of oozed its way down the state here from Chicago through Normal, Bloomington, and on down to St. Louis. Excuse me. But those short stretches of paved highway did already exist, and so they were just linked up. And what Mike referred to earlier about this road down by Shirley was in the Panagraph in 1914 when an article declared, "The hard road running southwest of Bloomington to Shirley is already beginning to show wear in places. It is no wonder, for most any time an auto leaves Bloomington for a joyride, it is down the hard road. Probably that road has 10 times more travel than it otherwise would have had, and that very thing shows how much such roads are liked." The designation as Route 66 provided for new pavement as well as linking up these shorter segments into one highway that passed through Illinois, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, and 3 time zones on its way to California. This is an ad that was in the November 1931 Panagraph, and Sprague Super Service is listed here. It's a little bit hard to read. It does give the address, but it also still identifies the road as Route 4, although it had officially become Route 66 in 1926. So most people still referred to it as Route 4. In 1930, Illinois had 7,500 miles of paved road. 300 of those were Route 66. It was the only state, except for 15 miles through Kansas, to have Route 66 completely hard surfaced. And today you will hear people from Kansas brag that they had theirs surfaced before us, but I hardly think the 15 miles competes with our 300. And this is the map of the route through Normal, Bloomington. It entered, sorry, I'm mixing up my, there we go, mixing up my laser and my pointer here. Okay, it entered up here along what is now Pine Street, slid along to Linden, down to Willow, and then went south on a 2-way Main Street. The concrete was barely set when people began to complain about the highway that such a short time before appeared as the answer to all of their problems. Residents complained about the traffic that brought noise and dirt. A housewife in Normal complained that if she hung out her laundry, it was soon covered in dirt and grit. For drivers, a through-town route, which with its stop-and-go traffic was time-consuming and inconvenient. Soon both those who lived along the road and travelers began to demand faster and safer roads. The original 2-lane road was replaced by a 4-lane highway that closely paralleled the first. This new road generally skirted town, so some businesses moved closer to the road. Others counted on the business Route 66 signs to funnel traffic to their business. And this is the belt line that Mike referred to earlier that goes around the east side of the towns. And this road was referred to as the Belt Line or the Beltway by locals. It was begun in 1940 and was finished shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. It featured a gentle sweeping curve. You can see that down here at the bottom. Excuse me. designed to handle 100-mile-per-hour traffic similar to Germany's Autobahn. It was renamed Veterans Parkway in 1979 to honor veterans of all wars, but many locals still refer to it by the former name, the Beltline. Does anybody here still call it the Beltline? Ruthie, get that hand up. I know you do. Excuse me. Eventually, this four-lane highway was replaced by an even more efficient and impersonal pavement, Interstate 55. Completed in 1965, another Beltline skirted the west side of Normal, Bloomington. It's over here, 55. Beginning in the early 1990s, there was a resurgence of interest in Route 66, and today there are thousands of international and domestic tourists who travel the road seeking an authentic experience. Many of these people travel through Normal along the original 1926 alignment. And just as a personal note, before I came here today, a group of RVs stopped by my building. There were 22 RVs traveling the road. They plan to take 50 days, that's 50 days, to get out to California. These are some dedicated Route 66 fans. And then while they were there, two Pontiac GTOs pulled into my lot, and they are having a run down to St. Louis today. So it is still very, very popular. Route 66 had a major impact on Normal and its citizens. For the first time, there was an unbroken, reliable, hard road that people could use to get to their destinations. The road brought many people to four major institutions in Normal, including the Illinois Soldiers Orphans Home, later renamed the Illinois Soldiers and Sailors Children's School, the Baby Fold, Illinois State Normal University, of course now Illinois State University, and Brokaw Hospital. Additionally, many people drove through town as they traveled through the state along the new road. The road entered Normal from the hamlet of Towanda along what is now Pine Street, turned south on Linden, then west on Willow to the two-way Main Street, turning south through Bloomington on its way to St. Louis before it headed to the west coast. We're going to take a PowerPoint drive along Route 66 in Normal as it appeared to a motorist between its designation in 1926 until the Beltline removed much of the traffic in 1940. We're going to drive it in four sections. From 1926 to 1940, the first section a motorist encountered was Pine Street to Linden Street. This stretch contained one major institution, 6 gas stations, 3 garages, 4 restaurants, lunch counters, 2 tourist camps, 2 markets, and 1 grocery store. Today there is 1 gas station and there is 1 garage. 4 additional buildings still stand along the route. The first institution a motorist encountered when entering Normal on Route 66 was the impressive campus of the Illinois Soldiers Orphans Home, which Ruthie Cobb did such a marvelous job providing us with history a week or so ago. While the Civil War was still raging, a group of local citizens met and prepared a proposal requesting that the Illinois State Legislature create an institution to care for the dependent children of the state's Civil War soldiers. A temporary home opened in August of 1867. This building is Old Main, the first permanent building, and housed the orphans and administration under one roof. Various other buildings were constructed over the years as children of soldiers and sailors of any war were admitted. In 1920, the home was open to all destitute children who were wards of the state. It was renamed the Illinois Soldiers and Sailors Children's School in 1931, and by 1937, while we're driving this tour, it housed 700 children. The Old Main building was raised in 1961, and the home was closed by the state in 1979. This image is obviously an aerial view, and perhaps that plane took off from our Normal airport to take this image. Beach Street is here. You can see Old Main. You can see Boys Row here, Girls Row here, Normandy Cottages, and so Pine Street was down here and Route 66. At 701 Pine, near the corner of Beach, the Diamond Tourist Camp opened in 1937, catering not only to travelers but to those who came to visit the children residing at ISSCS, as it was called. The business later became Manning's Tourist Village and closed in the early 1960s. This is the site of Royal Acres Mobile Home Park today. At 507 Pine, a service station called Johnson Oil Refining Company was opened in 1926. It was home to various gas companies, and in 1929 added a restaurant lunch counter called the Blue Lantern. This building was modified and continued to be a restaurant for many years. Today it's occupied by Smart Vet. In 1930, William W. Sprague constructed a two-story Tudor Revival-style building at 305 Pine Street and called it Sprague's Super Service. This is a 1966 photo, the earliest that I have. I'm still looking for original photos. If anyone has something in their attic, I'd sure appreciate it if you would dig that out for me. The first floor housed a cafe, city service gas station, and garage with apartments upstairs for the owner and the station's attendant mechanic. By 1935, the Gables Tourist Camp was located behind the building in an attempt to capture the overnight traveler business. This is something that I recently discovered I found very interesting. Although Normal's original charter provided for a dry town, after the repeal of Prohibition on December 5, 1933, there was some local confusion about what the 21st Amendment meant, and several establishments in Normal sold and served alcohol for a brief time. As you can see from this 1933 Pantograph advertisement, Sprague's Super Service would also deliver Blatz or Old Heidelberg beer to you, any place, anywhere, anytime. This is a picture of my building, Ryburn Place, which I have renamed from Sprague's Super Service, and I'm in the process of restoring it back to its 1930s glory. Across the street from me at 310 Pine, William Sneedaker operated a service station. You can see that the building has been altered. If you look closely, you'll see the brick columns, which were originally holding up the canopy of the gas station, and it's been filled in with these concrete blocks. So right now, it is the what's it called? A1 Security Locksmith. It does predate mine, though, because it did open in 1926. Additionally, Sneedaker operated a tourist camp at 306 Pine Street, which was known locally as Bill's Cabins. By 1932, he added a lunch counter. In 1926, Alvin Notestein opened a garage and gas station at 208 Pine Street. In 1928, he operated a restaurant next door at 206. In the early 1940s, this building became a Royal Crown bottling company and has since been home to a boat works, a farm equipment company, a tile company, a janitorial supply company, and a cabinet maker. It is currently storage for Sammy Rentals, one of the student apartment companies. Okay, the road tees at Linden, where we're going to turn left and enter the second section of the road. At this tee, there were 2 gas stations, 1 lunch counter, 1 restaurant, and 1 grocery store. The only business at Pine and Linden today is the Town and Country Animal Hospital. In 1926, though, the house on the northeast corner of Pine and Linden had a couple of gas pumps out front that could be accessed from either Linden or Pine Street. It was simply called Fred B. Johnson Service Station. Motorists could stop on the west side of the street at 901 North Linden Street for a meal at Jones and Jones Lunch Counter, or at 809 North Linden to visit Lawrence Gearing's grocery store and restaurant. And by 1932, another service station opened called Warner Brothers at 808 and a half North Linden Street. Continuing south on Linden, we're going to turn right on Willow, the third section of our trip. From Willow to Maine. Excuse me. There's 1 institution, 3 restaurants, and 1 gas station on this section. The institution remains, and there is 1 restaurant. The second institution we encounter, driving along Route 66 in the 30s and 40s, is the Baby Fold at 108 East Willow Street. Nancy Mason donated her home in 1902 to the Methodist Episcopal Church to be used by active and retired Methodist deaconesses that operated Deaconess Hospital, which eventually became Brokaw Hospital, then Bromin Hospital, and now Advocate Bromin. The local deaconess women saw a growing need in our community, care for orphaned and abandoned children, and in 1905 the Mason home was organized as a home for young children. Over the next several decades, the Baby Fold underwent significant changes in both services and facilities. In 1910, the Board of Trustees met and decided to move to 4 lots on East Willow. The home was considered to be virtually in the country and had no running water, no electricity, and no access to paved roads. Today, the Baby Fold cares for children and youth with emotional and behavioral disabilities or at risk for a variety of reasons. They take pride in the fact that they never give up on a child. Just off Willow on Fell Avenue was Anson's Lunch Counter, run by an African American, one of the few places that African Americans could get a meal while traveling through town. Additionally, it was an important social spot for the local African American community and students. At 312 West Willow stood a place called Pinky's Lunchbox, and I want to thank Mitch Anheier, a local historian, for restoring this image, and Jan Kreitzer, the daughter of the Kreitzers who own Pinky's, for the following images of Pinky's. Also here, I do want to give kind of a shout out to that wonderful online community. You know you grew up in or around Bloomington-Normal when you remember. Julie Rudat-Dami is the administrator of this site, and they've been very helpful in answering questions that I have had and in providing images, including the Blue Lantern image that you saw provided by Joe Woith. If you're interested in local history at all, you need to request to join this site. Pinky was Loren Kreitzer's nickname because of his red hair. On December 7, 1941, Loren's wife, Margaret, heard FDR on the radio. Pearl Harbor had been bombed. Pinky started frying free hamburgers for the students who ran to the tiny restaurant to get the news. And these are Loren and Margaret Kreitzer in front of Pinky's. Parties were thrown there as men went off to war and when they came home, and all food was free to servicemen and women. A wall contained photos, letters, and postcards from soldiers. Other restaurants and many, many pizza places occupied this site before it was torn down in the late 1980s to make room for student apartments. At that corner, or at the corner of Main and Willow, J.F. Lusher opened a gas station in 1928, later moving to 510. Across the street on the southeast corner at 509 West Willow sat Art Smith's barbecue lunch counter. Later, Chester L. Severson's continued the barbecue tradition with his famous catchphrase question, "Have you et with Chet yet?" We're going to turn left onto this two-way main street and proceed to Division on the last section of the road. The motorist encountered 9 gas stations, 4 restaurants, and 5 grocery stores. Today there are 3 gas stations and 9 restaurants. The third institution we encounter along Route 66 was Illinois State Normal University. As Mike has told you, Jesse Fell located his home in this area and laid out of town in 1854. Through the efforts of Fell and other influential men, ISNU was officially founded in 1857 as Illinois' first state university. In February of 1865, the state government of Illinois approved a special charter which incorporated the fledgling community surrounding the school, changing its name to Normal, which was a name given to institutions that train teachers. This is a slide which would have been contemporary with our motor tour, possibly taken by a plane that took off from the Normal Airport, the 1930s. And you can see that we have several substantial buildings here. This is Old Main. Behind it is North Hall, which was the hall for training teachers. We have Felmley Hall. We have Edwards, Cook Hall, or the Castle, as many people called it, and Fell Hall. In 1965, the purpose of the university was expanded beyond teaching to a full liberal arts curriculum. It was renamed Illinois State University at Normal, and in 1968, simply Illinois State University. The next institution encountered is Brokaw Hospital, which is just off of Main Street. In 1894, 5 local physicians each contributed $500 and began looking for a future hospital site to serve McLean County. An ideal spot was finally located on 8 acres midway between the towns of Bloomington and Normal, and very much in the country. Deaconess Hospital officially opened May 8, 1896, and within 2 years it outgrew its capacity and a second building was begun. Does this sound familiar, the additions to hospitals? In 1901, Abram Brokaw, a wealthy plowmaker, made a sizable contribution of $10,000, and the hospital name was changed to Brokaw Hospital in his family's honor. Brokaw Hospital, as with other hospitals of the day, was known for treating needy patients for free or for lower costs. It also created a school of nursing in January of 1902. And as I mentioned, eventually the Brokaw Hospital merged with Mennonite, becoming Bromin, and is now known as Advocate Bromin. Okay. Some might argue that this is also an institution. This could be our 5th institution on our road. And in fact, it is the most famous restaurant in Normal, the Steak and Shake. It sits at the corner of Main and Virginia at 1219 South Main Street. And thank you to George Perkins and the McLean County Museum of History for this image. Note the original entrance on Main Street. Down here, this little covered entry. The building is virtually unchanged. Excuse me. 2 other people operated restaurants at this site beginning in 1929, but Gus Belt opened the Shell Inn in 1933 as a gas station and chicken restaurant. It was known for its Friday and Saturday night 25-cent fish fries, advertising in the pantograph, direct from fresh water to our frying pan. Taking advantage of the repeal of Prohibition and the temporary confusion about the legality of selling alcohol in Normal, the ad continued. Free cold bottle of Meisterbrau beer included. Another ad proclaimed, where you see the cars, you will find good food and cold beer. By 1935, Gus Belt had added curb service and advertised ice-cold Meisterbrau, full-strength, old beer, for 10 cents a bottle or $1 for a dozen to go out. Steak and Shake's slogan, "Inside it must be right," originally referred to the practice of wheeling a barrel of T-bone, sirloin, and round steaks into the public area and grinding them into burgers in front of customers to reassure them as to the wholesomeness of the end product. Customers could see for themselves that steaks were being ground into hamburger meat. The open grill line remains visible to customers today. The original building at the intersection of Main Street and Virginia Avenue was damaged by fire in the early 1960s, but it was repaired and its dining room expanded a bit. It's become famous in the United States as well as with international Route 66 travelers who pause in their journey to visit the site of the original Steak and Shake. In the late 1990s, Steak and Shake sold this building to Monocle's Pizza. And so a Route 66 traveler continued south on Main, passing Division Street into Bloomington, much as they do today, not knowing that they have passed from one town to the next. Happy birthday, Normal. You're looking good at 150. And thank you to the town of Normal for hosting this series of lectures. Dr. Paul Holsinger led off the series with a comprehensive history of Normal's early years, followed by Ruthie Cobb's excellent lecture about the Illinois Soldiers and Sailors Children's School. The next lecture takes place right here at 2 p.m. next Sunday, the 27th, when Dr. Mark Wyman presents Racial Segregation in Normal Bloomington. I hope you've gained an appreciation for the rich history associated with transportation in Normal. I hope you will get out and travel the road and get your kicks on Route 66. Mike and I thank you and will answer any questions that you have, and I'll be happy to stick around after to talk about your memories of Route 66. Thank you.
You know, one thing, too, I forgot to mention, because this would be a 50th anniversary of that. When 55 was being routed, there was a big push to put 55 through Peoria. And this community politically mobilized and sent busloads of people to Springfield to keep 55 on the alignment with Route 66. So, you know, it was very much a political effort that people were very aware that losing that route through actually a further distance to Peoria would have had a very adverse impact on the community economically. So, you know, Mark.
Can you run the mic? If I run the mic out to you, then we'll capture the sound on the recording for the website, so give me a second to do that. And then y'all can maybe share the other one.
I wonder if Normal and Bloomington had this kind of a fight. I was working in Livingston, Montana in the early 60s as the interstate was starting to approach, and I talked to some store owners, and they were panicky because the highway used to come right down Main Street, and this was going to go around, and what's going to happen to our town? Was that kind of fight here?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it absolutely was with Route 66, and we see a lot of communities that just dried up and blew away because the traffic went around them. In this case, most of the business moved out to the new Belt Line and continued on. Luckily for our section up there on Pine Street, we still had a lot of local people who would, do business there, who would trade with the grocery store and that sort of thing. But it pretty quickly fell out by about 1945 or so. There really wasn't any gas being sold up there. You could stop at the garage, and the grocery store went away pretty quickly. There were a couple of produce markets, too, that folded. But we did count on local people once the road went around us.
And I would cross Division Street to think of downtown Bloomington and the department stores, and the big dilemma up through when those stores began to close in the 70s was where are you going to park? And the whole idea of building on the periphery where you could build giant parking lots. And boy, it was so convenient, even though you may walk the same distance from your car in the parking lot to the big store as you walk the same distance from your car somewhere along Main Street to the department store. You somehow felt you were closer.
Other questions?
Interesting, Mike, that we have, I think I've mentioned this to some of you before, but my home is out north on Linden Street, parallel to the ICC, which is about half a mile west of us. And the old part of my house is an iconic memento of the construction of that. My basement is made of Wisconsin sandstone, which doesn't exist around here, but was hauled down to build up the railroad and apparently stolen from there by the original builder, borrowed. Not only that, there's a well house, an old well house there, and upstairs in the well house had to hold a big barrel of water. And I looked and I thought, boy, they have steel beams here to hold up that water. That's really great in that day. And one day I finally looked at it carefully, and they're rails. So we also have some of the original rails in my house on the old railroad. And I wondered if a lot of farmhouses along the way, that same thing was going on. I don't know.
They're agents of the Illinois Central Railroad here, and so they're going to take your convention as there's many, many stories, particularly the Chicago and Alton shops, of people carrying material and often being allowed to take scrap or material home at night. And particularly when the German-Hungarians came in the 1910, 1920s of, basically group home building. And I'm sure probably the Irish did the same thing too, and using scrap material, parts of old wooden railroad cars, and taking it home to build their home.
Any other
When I
questions?
did some oral history interviews about the Chicago and Alton shops for the book that the Museum of History has published, several men were very happy to show me the items that they commandeered. I think believing that the statute of limitations had probably finally run its course. One man in particular who'd been a sign painter had quite a stock of gold leaf that he had in his possession. Another one did show me parts of his home that he had built from pieces of the cars. So yeah, that did go on.
And maybe one other piece of that I've never quite been able to locate, but people claim it's true, maybe people have information, of Boxcar Houses. And Galesburg has done a good job of documenting that history, where particularly Mexican immigrant workers who came in the 1910, 1920 period were basically housed in surplus boxcars along the railroad right-of-way as their work camp, which eventually became family homes.
Mike doesn't know this about me, but I lived in a boxcar home when I was a senior in high school up by Carlock. There were 3 in a row, and my family rented it from a family. So, yeah, I guess, repurposing, that's the whole idea, isn't it?
What about diners? Did they rail cars, some of the old diners?
The question was, what about diners? Were they old rail cars? Yes, absolutely. Although eventually they were purpose-built. I think they were made in Michigan and shipped all over the U.S. But yeah, people converted those. I just read something in the Panagraph maybe a week or maybe 2 weeks ago about someone who's taken an old mobile or an old trailer and has converted that to a coffee shop. I think it's in Forest, Illinois. So there's always that repurposing going on.
When I was a child in Paris, Illinois, when we would go into town, we would travel on the right side of the road was bricked, and the left side coming out was gravel. And this was because taking the grain and the produce into town, the wagons or the vehicles would not sink into the brick. Coming back, they'd be lighter and they could go over the gravel. And I wondered if this was a common practice or if there was anything where the road was developed in a split way, where one side of it to handle the heavier traffic.
You live in a very strange place, Linda.
Terri, you know me. You know that's not true.
I've never heard of that. I think that's a wonderful story. Have you heard of that?
And on the way into town in the summer, you were very careful because the heat would cause those bricks to heave. There could be a huge, as much as a foot-high pile of bricks because they had just kind of bumped up out of the ground.
There is a house that is the size of a boxcar on Beach and a couple blocks south of Pine. It's so tiny. It's a little. Just swing by there. I mean, every time I drive by it, I think, is that a train car? I mean, that's been covered up. It's really
That's
tiny.
Beach and Willow.
Is it at Beach and Willow?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, it's tiny.
Yeah, Beach and Willow.
Just so that you know, all of the lectures will be put online on the town's website, www.normal.org. There's an icon for 150 at the bottom, and you should be able to navigate your way to the lecture series. We have Dr. Holsinger's full presentation up along with written remarks, which we are getting from all of our speakers. Also, we're providing links to any of the WGLT or WJBC interviews that have happened, and there's been a great series of those, especially on GLT, that we're trying to keep all these materials in one place so that if you want to share them with out-of-town family or friends, if you just want to hear this again, you can go online and hear it, and that will be the case for the upcoming lecture and the 2 panel discussions as well. So if there are no further questions, I think maybe if we thank our speakers one more time. And thank you very much for coming to our facility. If you are parked in the deck, it is free on Sundays, so you're fine to get out. And we hope you visit the merchandise table on your way out. Exit through the gift shop.